Julian Carter was the kind of man who signed million-dollar deals over imported wine and never had to check a price tag in his life. Yet on this grey Tuesday afternoon, with the world buzzing past his tinted windows, he found himself drawn not to the skyscrapers he owned, but to a forgotten corner of the city where time had clearly given up. His sleek Rolls-Royce purred to a stop outside a cafe that looked like it belonged to another century, its once vibrant sign barely clinging to life, flickering open, as though it wasn't entirely convinced it should be. The brick facade was chipped, the door creaked with exhaustion, and yet something in that imperfection pulled him in, a quiet invitation away from the marble lobbies and cold boardrooms he usually inhabited. As Julian stepped out, the soles of his handcrafted shoes met a sidewalk cracked like dried earth, and for a moment he hesitated. What would a man like him find in a place like this? But he walked in anyway, ducking slightly beneath a warped wooden frame, greeted not by polished floors or welcoming hosts, but the raw scent of old coffee, the hum of an aged jukebox, and the faint clink of ceramic against ceramic. Only two patrons sat scattered among the mismatched tables, one reading yesterday's paper with a furrowed brow, the other stirring sugar into a half-empty cup, like it was a ritual. The place was worn, but not without soul. Photographs of smiling faces long forgotten hung unevenly on the walls, and faded curtains swayed gently with the breeze that snuck through the cracked windows. Julian moved slowly, his tailored navy suit drawing stares like he was a painting hung in the wrong gallery, his presence a silent disruption to the place's weary rhythm. He took a seat at the counter, the vinyl stool groaning beneath him as if offended by his wealth, and rested his hands on a surface sticky with time, not luxury. He glanced at the laminated menu, its corners curled like old leaves, with prices that hadn't changed in decades and dishes named without flair. Ham and eggs, hot coffee, apple pie, maybe? There was something strangely grounding about it. His phone buzzed, but he ignored it for the first time in years, letting the digital world pass him by while he remained still, untouched, in this pocket of slow time. He looked around, watching the waitress in the back refill a coffee pot, the cook wipe his brow with a ragged towel, and realized that here nobody cared about stock prices or Forbes lists. For a moment, the pressure in his chest, that constant weight he'd grown used to, seemed to ease. He felt anonymous, unseen, not because of ignorance, but because here no one needed to know who he was to serve him coffee. And that anonymity was strangely liberating. The million-dollar cufflinks on his sleeves sparkled against the cafe's dim lighting like tiny contradictions, yet he didn't adjust them. He leaned back and let the quiet wrap around him, not as a burden, but as a balm. It had been years since he'd sat somewhere and just been. He remembered something his mother once said when he was just a boy. Sometimes the smallest places hold the biggest truths. Back then, he hadn't understood her. Now, seated on a wobbly stool in a place forgotten by the world, he began to wonder if maybe she had meant a place like this. He noticed the hand-painted sign above the register that read, "Welcome to Maggie's, where hearts are fed too." And something about it hit deeper than it should have. He took a breath, feeling it settle all the way to his bones. He didn't come here looking for food, and yet he was already being nourished, just not in the way he'd expected. And unknown to him, behind the faded curtain near the kitchen door, a pair of curious eyes had already been watching him. Not with recognition of his status or envy of his wealth, but with the soft wonder of someone who saw more than just a man in a suit. In a place where nothing sparkled, his arrival had created a quiet ripple. Something was about to begin, not with fanfare or applause, but with a coffee order and a conversation he never could have anticipated. Because fate doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply flickers like a tired neon sign, daring you to walk through the door and find out why. Sophie Turner emerged from behind the faded curtain just as Julian's fingers brushed the edge of his coffee cup, her timing unintentional, yet somehow perfect, like a note in the right key, played at the exact right moment. She wore an apron smudged with flour and coffee stains that told stories of long shifts and hurried breakfasts, but it couldn't dim the light in her face. As the bell above the door settled back into silence, she gave him a curious once-over, the sharp lines of his tailored suit, the polished cufflinks catching what little sunlight trickled through the dusty blinds, and quirked a brow that said she was no stranger to oddities, but this one was special. Her stride was confident but casual, as though she'd long stopped caring what people thought and had learned to stand tall in a world that often tried to fold her. "Welcome to Maggie's," she greeted, her voice laced with warmth and wit. "We've got great coffee and terrible chairs." The contrast between her humility and his poised elegance should have clashed, but instead it blended into something unexpectedly soothing. Julian smiled, a real smile, not the PR kind he wore for cameras, and nodded, surprised by the chuckle that escaped his lips. There was a spark in her eyes that danced like mischief, but carried the weight of someone who had seen storms and survived them. She scribbled down his order with a flick of her wrist and disappeared briefly behind the counter, returning moments later with a steaming mug that somehow smelled like memories. "1 cup of mediocre magic," she said with a wink, placing it gently before him. Their conversation began with small talk, the weather, the jukebox tunes, the cracked sugar shaker, but quickly spilled into unexpected territory, like a stream jumping its banks. Sophie didn't speak to him with reverence or fear, didn't bat her lashes or play the role of someone who needed saving. She was bold, sharp, and refreshingly unfiltered, tossing sarcasm like confetti, but lacing it with kindness. Julian found himself listening more than speaking, caught off guard by how her every sentence was like a hand reaching past his armor, tapping gently on doors he thought he'd long since locked. She spoke of long shifts and short nights, of customers who never tipped and regulars who brought in pictures of their grandkids, and somehow it all painted a picture more vivid than the art on any penthouse wall. He noticed how she glanced out the window every few minutes, as if looking for something, or someone she hadn't yet found, and wondered what dreams she'd tucked behind that practiced smile. There was something deeply rooted in her optimism, like it was grown from hardship, not naivety, and that made it all the more magnetic. He sipped the coffee slowly, though it was just average, letting the warmth of it settle into the hollow spaces in his chest. In that half hour, Sophie unknowingly chipped away at the detachment he had spent years cultivating, layer by layer, word by word. Her laughter, unforced and genuine, seemed to echo louder than any applause he'd ever received at business galas. She mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she once wanted to be an artist, that the cafe was meant to be a stepping stone, but had turned into a lifeboat. Julian asked questions he never thought he'd care about, what she painted, what inspired her, whether she still picked up a brush. Her answers were unpolished but sincere, stories wrapped in paint-splattered metaphors, and he found himself leaning in, listening like her voice held the coordinates to something lost inside him. For a man who had everything, he realized he had missed out on this, the unscripted beauty of human connection, the depth of a soul not for sale. Sophie didn't know who he was in the world outside this cafe, and more remarkably, she didn't care. She saw the man, not the money, and treated him with the same honest grace she'd likely offered to every customer who wandered in. Julian caught himself watching her more than his surroundings, her hands moving gracefully between tasks, her eyes scanning the room, not just for orders, but for needs. She refilled coffee without being asked, offered extra napkins before spills happened, and smiled at the old man in the corner like he was royalty. It was then Julian realized something that shook him more than any corporate betrayal or market crash. He was drawn to her not because she was different from his world, but because she made him feel different in it. She stirred something buried deep beneath years of routine and ambition, a long-forgotten hunger, not for success, but for substance. As he lingered, forgetting meetings and dismissing calls, He wondered if fate wasn't just a story people told themselves to explain coincidences, but a force that sometimes wore aprons and carried coffee pots. And though he'd only just met her, Julian felt with startling clarity that Sophie Turner was about to become the most meaningful chapter in his very carefully planned life. From that afternoon on, something quietly shifted in Julian's world, a gravitational pull that drew him back to the chipped door of Maggie's cafe each morning, abandoning boardroom briefings for the scent of burnt toast and possibility. It wasn't just about the coffee anymore, or the worn vinyl booths that creaked under time's weight. It was Sophie. She was always there, sleeves rolled up, hair twisted in a loose bun, moving with a rhythm that made chaos look like choreography. Julian sat in the same booth each time, not out of habit, but because it gave him the clearest view of her, how she wiped the counter with precision, how she smiled even when she looked exhausted, how she paused to help an elderly customer button his coat without needing to be asked. Every visit revealed another layer. They talked more now, longer, deeper, and he started asking questions not as a businessman trying to solve a puzzle, but as a man hungry to understand a soul. And Sophie didn't hold back. She spoke of her dreams without pretense, her voice carrying both softness and steel. Her art studio wasn't just a plan, it was a purpose, a sanctuary for children lost in the noise of broken homes and overlooked streets. They need color in a world that only gives them gray, she said, and something about those words clung to Julian's ribs like a memory. One day, she slipped a weathered sketchbook into his hands, unsure, as if sharing too much too soon. He opened it gently, as though the pages might break, and inside he found a universe. Each drawing bled raw emotion, fiery reds for anger, cool blues for loneliness, golden glows of rare joy. And he turned each page with reverence, like a priest flipping through sacred scripture. "I paint to survive," she told him quietly, as she cleared a table nearby, not looking at him. Not financially, emotionally. The simplicity of her truth unraveled something knotted inside him. Julian Carter, the man who signed seven-figure contracts over dinner, who wore watches more expensive than entire city blocks, found himself mesmerized not by riches, but by the quiet power of this woman's resilience. He told her, slowly at first, about his own emptiness, about the homes he owned but never returned to, the dinners filled with laughter that never reached his heart, the awards that lined his office walls but meant nothing when the nights grew long. Sophie listened with stillness, never once flinching from the hollow echoes he'd always hidden behind wealth. Her silence wasn't absence, it was presence. She didn't interrupt to fix him, didn't offer trite comforts. She just let him be broken, and somehow that felt like the kindest thing anyone had ever done. One morning, as he stirred cream into his coffee, he looked up and said, "I've never told anyone that before." And Sophie just smiled, that soft, knowing smile that said she understood without needing to explain why. They were from different galaxies, his paved in gold, hers stitched in survival. But their scars looked eerily alike under the light of honesty. Julian began to see the cracks in her too, not as flaws, but as proof she had been through fire and still chose to stand. He noticed how she sometimes touched her wrist absent-mindedly when talking about her childhood, or how her laughter had a slight tremble when she mentioned her father. She never dove into the details, but the silence between her words painted enough. In those moments, amid the clink of dishes and hum of old jukebox melodies, they forged something rare. Connection without demand, intimacy without expectation. He watched as Sophie sat with a crying mother who couldn't pay for pancakes, offering her a free meal and a hug, not for show, but because that was who she was. He realized she gave the world what it so often failed to give her: kindness, dignity, second chances. And somewhere between those slow sips of coffee and accidental heart exchanges, Julian understood something terrifying and beautiful. He didn't just admire her, he needed her not as a savior, but as a reminder that life wasn't meant to be lived behind walls of glass and marble. She made him feel human again. And Sophie, though she didn't say it aloud, had started to look forward to his visits more than she dared admit. He saw her, not just the waitress uniform or the tired eyes, but the artist, the dreamer, the warrior beneath. In a world that often passed her by, Julian Carter had stopped and stayed. For the first time in years, they both felt less alone. That evening, clouds rolled in like silent witnesses to a turning point neither of them could have predicted. The city outside darkened beneath a heavy curtain of rain, lightning clawing across the sky as if the heavens themselves were unraveling secrets. Julian stood by the window of Maggie's cafe, watching the streets blur in waves of water, uncertain whether to leave or let the night decide for him. Sophie, sensing his hesitation, offered a quiet invitation, a simple nod toward the back room, a place usually off-limits to customers, but now transformed by the weight of unspoken understanding. He followed her through a narrow hallway lit by a single dim bulb, past walls lined with peeling wallpaper, and years of untold stories. The room she led him into was small, intimate, yet strangely warm. A worn-out couch sat against one wall, its fabric fraying at the corners, and a mismatched collection of books lay scattered across old wooden shelves. A few of Sophie's paintings hung proudly, bold, emotional bursts of colour that seemed to hum with memory. As the storm outside grew louder, thunder pounding like a restless heart, the room seemed to grow quieter, cloaked in the hush of something sacred. Julian sat on the edge of the couch, unbuttoning his damp blazer, unsure if he felt more exposed from the rain or the vulnerability pressing against his chest. Sophie brought him a blanket and 2 chipped mugs of hot tea, her fingers brushing his as she handed one over. The moment lingered, delicate as a heartbeat. Then, without pretense or warning, words began to spill. Julian spoke first, his voice low, almost unfamiliar. He shared stories he rarely voiced aloud, of boardrooms that echoed with applause but never love, of a father who measured worth by quarterly profits and offered affection only in the form of trust funds. "He built an empire," Julian whispered, but he never looked back to see who was following. Sophie listened with a stillness that made him feel heard in a way money never could. When her turn came, she didn't dramatize her past, she simply laid it bare. Her mother's passing had left a hole too wide for words, and she'd spent the better part of her teenage years raising her younger brother Jacob, juggling 3 jobs to keep the lights on and his dreams alive. The cafe, she explained, was more than a job. It was her anchor, the one place that didn't ask for more than she could give. Her eyes shimmered with the weight of resilience, her voice steady, yet soaked in sorrow and strength. Julian's gaze never left hers. He wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. He was seeing a warrior who had turned her pain into compassion, her survival into art. The rain outside became a lullaby of chaos, but inside that room, the storm served only to make their quiet sanctuary feel more profound. As if moved by instinct rather than decision, Julian reached across the space between them and took her hand, not with entitlement or desperation, but with a gentle need to be tethered to something real. Sophie didn't flinch. Her fingers curled into his like it was the most natural thing in the world. They sat like that for minutes that felt like hours, time dissolving in the warmth of shared silence. She looked at him not as the man who wore $1,000 suits, but as someone brave enough to admit his emptiness. And in her eyes, Julian saw not just empathy, but invitation. She didn't need him to rescue her. She needed someone who wouldn't run from her truth. And he, in turn, didn't want to be admired. He wanted to be known. With the flickering light casting gold on her cheeks and the scent of tea and rain wrapping around them, something unnamed blossomed in that space, a fragile intimacy untainted by expectation. They didn't speak of love, not yet, but their eyes did. They didn't promise anything, but their hands remained joined long after the tea turned cold. It was a beginning neither of them had planned, but one they both needed, a fire lit not by passion alone, but by the quiet bravery of opening old wounds to let in new light. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent. But inside that room, Julian and Sophie had begun building something that no rain could wash away. The rain had stopped by dawn, but the warmth in Sophie's chest lingered long after Julian had quietly slipped away, leaving nothing behind but a folded note with ink smudged from his hurried fingers. "Meet me here at midnight." The words echoed in her mind throughout the day as she poured coffee, wiped counters, and pretended her heart wasn't racing every time the clock ticked forward. She didn't understand what it meant. Was it goodbye, a confession, or something in between? By the time the sky turned dark again, her nerves had morphed into anticipation. She stood outside the cafe just before midnight, the streets quiet, the night humming with possibility. When she stepped inside, her breath caught. The usually dim and tired cafe glowed with soft candlelight, every table flickering like a whisper of romance. The jukebox hummed low with a classic ballad, something slow and soulful, filling the space with emotion. And there, in the center of it all, stood Julian, not the polished businessman with guarded eyes, but a man visibly nervous, hopeful, holding something behind his back like a boy hiding a secret. His smile trembled slightly as she approached. "You once told me that everyone deserves the space to dream," he said, voice husky, like the words meant more than just a quote. "I've spent my life building places people paid to escape to. You want to build one they come to feel whole." He handed her a folder, and for a moment she hesitated, unsure what could possibly be inside. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing papers, official, stamped, and startlingly real. It took her a few seconds to process. A fully renovated warehouse just 4 blocks from the cafe, zoning permits secured, interior design left blank for her vision, and the deed already transferred to her name. Her name, Sophie Turner, owner. The realization hit like a wave. This is mine," she breathed, tears already rising, blurring the edges of the text. "Why would you do this for me?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. Julian stepped forward, the folder slipping from her hands to the floor as he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Because in 1 week you've given me more than all my years of wealth ever have," he said softly. "You reminded me that hearts are meant to beat beside others, not behind walls." Sophie didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did both, her arms folding around him with a force that surprised them both. Her sobs were quiet, but shook her shoulders, and Julian held her without words, letting the warmth of the moment drown out every insecurity. He wasn't saving her, he was finally learning how to give without expecting anything in return. And she wasn't accepting charity, she was receiving belief, trust, a foundation for a dream she had nurtured in silence for too long. After a while, she pulled back, just enough to look into his eyes. "You've changed," she whispered. "No," he replied. "You just showed me who I really was." The jukebox shifted to a slower song, one neither of them knew, but both felt in their bones. Without asking, he offered his hand. Without hesitation, she took it. They danced between cracked tiles and flickering candles, between booths stained with years of memories and floors that creaked like old souls. The world outside didn't matter. In that moment, amid mismatched chairs and faded menus, they found something beautiful. 2 lives colliding not through accident, but through alignment. Julian twirled her, and she laughed, head tilted back, joy echoing off every surface like bells announcing something holy. The space between them had been filled, not with wealth or promises, but with a kind of honesty neither of them had known they needed. As they moved in quiet rhythm, her cheek rested against his chest, and his heartbeat told her everything she didn't need him to say out loud. Love wasn't loud. It didn't always arrive wrapped in perfection. It snuck in during quiet nights, in empty cafes lit by faith and candlelight. And that night, as the music played on and the world continued spinning beyond the windows, Sophie and Julian danced like time itself had decided to wait. As the last notes from the jukebox faded into the hush of early dawn, Sophie and Julian remained in each other's arms, but soon life, with all its energy and urgency, called them into motion. In the months that followed, the abandoned warehouse transformed. What was once an empty shell of cracked cement and rusted beams became a sanctuary of color, creativity, and second chances. Sophie named it the Hearth, a symbol of warmth, imagination, and belonging, and it quickly became more than an art studio. It was a pulse in the heart of a forgotten neighborhood. Julian showed up every morning in jeans and old sneakers, sleeves rolled, hair messy, paint stains on his collar. No longer a man consumed by luxury, but one reborn through purpose. Together they scrubbed walls, repaired broken floorboards, repainted dreams with every stroke of a brush. Kids arrived shy, hesitant, unsure, but under Sophie's patient guidance and Julian's quiet encouragement, they bloomed, their drawings chaotic and beautiful, their stories pouring out in color. Word spread fast. The millionaire who gave up skyscrapers for a single-story studio, and the waitress who never stopped believing in something bigger than herself. The community that once ignored the old warehouse now filled it with footsteps and laughter, donating supplies, cheering during student exhibits, baking cookies for weekend workshops. Sophie stood at the center of it all like a lighthouse, guiding, nurturing, loving, not just the children, but Julian too, who found in her the courage to live with his heart wide open. Their love didn't shout, didn't need grand gestures. It was felt in how he always brought her a cup of tea without asking, in how her hand found his when a child struggled with their painting, in how they cleaned up every evening side by side without ever needing to speak. Though she never truly left the cafe, still working shifts on quiet mornings to stay grounded in her roots, it was the studio that became her home, a reflection of her soul painted across every wall. Julian's empire still existed, but he no longer measured his worth in profits or expansions. Instead, he watched a little boy who once feared holding a pencil sketch an entire galaxy, and it made him feel richer than he ever had. His business partners were baffled, headlines puzzled over his shift, but Julian didn't care. He had exchanged fleeting admiration for lasting impact, and in every smile from a child, he saw returns that no stock market could rival. Sophie's old sketchbook now sat in a glass case at the studio entrance, pages open to the painting she made the day the warehouse was gifted to her, a swirl of wildflowers bursting through concrete, with a single figure in a navy blue suit watching them bloom. The image became the studio's symbol, a reminder that beauty can rise even in the harshest cracks. They weren't building walls, they were shaping hearts. Local schools started partnering with the Hearth, and soon buses of children from other neighborhoods arrived, eager to explore what their hands and minds could make. One evening, after the last child had left, Julian found Sophie sitting cross-legged in the middle of the floor, covered in blue paint, tears of joy running down her cheeks as she stared at a mural the kids had finished, a giant heart surrounded by small fingerprints. "We did this," she whispered. Julian knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "You made them believe," he said softly. "You showed them they matter." In return, Sophie looked up at him, eyes full of quiet wonder. "And you showed me I wasn't alone." In the golden hours of twilight, when the studio emptied and only their shadows remained on the wall, they would dance again, not out of celebration, but gratitude. Love like theirs didn't just change lives, it restored them. The world still rushed on outside, blind to their little haven, but within those walls miracles bloomed in watercolors, crayons, and chalk dust. They weren't just creating art, they were creating safety, joy, purpose. Together they had taken all the broken parts of their pasts and molded something beautiful. And in doing so they discovered that sometimes love isn't loud or dramatic, it's steady, it's shared purpose, it's two hands painting a future, one brushstroke at a time. As twilight painted the streets in gold and lavender, Sophie and Julian found themselves back where everything began, sitting in their familiar booth at Maggie's, now gently refurbished, but still holding the soul of its weathered charm, the scent of old coffee and new beginnings lingering in the air. The jukebox still played softly in the corner, and though time had moved forward, the rhythm of their hearts stayed tethered to that first spark, that first accidental encounter. Outside the cafe window, laughter echoed from a group of teens walking home from the hearth, their arms splattered with paint, their backpacks stuffed with sketches and dreams. Sophie watched them with a quiet smile, the kind only someone who had once lived with empty pockets and a full heart could truly wear. Julian squeezed her hand, the familiar warmth of her fingers grounding him more deeply than any empire he had ever built. Over the years, he had stepped back from boardrooms and billion-dollar deals to be part of something far more valuable, stories, real ones. Stories that weren't told in headlines or financial statements, but in the scribbles of a child discovering color, in the eyes of a single mother learning to dream again, in the hopeful tremble of a teen dipping a brush into possibility. Maggie's had become more than a cafe. It was a symbol. Locals came not just for coffee, but for connection, inspiration, a glimpse of what could happen when two people dared to look beyond the surface. A plaque on the wall near the counter now read, "Where art met heart." Sophie still worked a few shifts a week, not because she had to, but because she loved the sound of someone walking in lost and leaving lighter. Julian never missed those mornings. He'd sit near the corner, sometimes with a notepad, sometimes just watching her move through the room like sunlight in motion. Their love hadn't faded. It had matured, ripened into something unshakable. They had faced doubts, whispers from his old world, skepticism from hers, but through it all, they stayed rooted in their truth. They didn't need validation, just each other. The hearth now had 3 branches across the city, each one tailored to the community it served. Sophie trained new teachers, mentored teen artists, and hosted exhibits where neighborhood children displayed their work with pride. Julian handled the logistics quietly, letting her lead the way. His name no longer introduced him. His actions did. He had given up chasing success and instead created spaces where others could find theirs. One day, a little girl with pigtails approached him at the studio and said, "Are you Sophie's husband?" He chuckled, nodded, and answered, "Yes, but I'm also her biggest fan." That had become his identity. The man who saw greatness in someone when no one else looked close enough. They never lived in a mansion. They chose a modest house near the studio with a small garden where Sophie grew daisies and Julian wrote letters he never sent. Every evening they walked hand in hand through their neighborhood, stopping to chat with neighbors, sometimes getting roped into impromptu sidewalk chalk contests or kids asking for critiques on their doodles. Julian, once untouchable in his polished solitude, had become woven into the fabric of a place that valued people over prestige. Sophie, once invisible behind a cracked counter, had become a legend of light and perseverance. Together, they had become something rare. Proof that love doesn't just mend what's broken, it builds what never existed before. That evening, back at Maggie's, they watched the sun dip behind the rooftops as steam curled from their coffee mugs. They didn't need to speak. Their silence was rich with gratitude, memory, and an unshakable knowing that their lives had collided not by accident, but by design. The waitress who once served hope by the cupful and the millionaire who once mistook wealth for purpose had written a story that no fairy tale could rival. As they clinked their mugs gently and let the warmth seep into their palms, they looked into each other's eyes, not searching for answers, but celebrating the journey that led them from loneliness to belonging. Outside, a new girl entered the cafe, nervous and unsure, and Sophie waved her over with the same kindness that once changed her own life. Julian smiled. The cycle was beginning again. They didn't need fireworks or fanfare. Their love glowed quietly in every corner of that cafe, every canvas in the studio, every life touched by their choice to believe in the beauty of the overlooked. The world still rushed by, obsessed with headlines and speed, but inside that small booth, time slowed down, and love, in all its quiet glory, lived on. Not in grand gestures, but in steady presence, not in riches, but in roots. And in that moment, as the sky softened and the city hushed, they knew with absolute certainty they hadn't just found each other, they had found home.